Hello and welcome to the second episode of 5 Favourite Books with me, Bella Debrera. Joining me again today to talk about one of his favourite books is foreign affairs journalist and commentator Greg Sheridan. Today's book is The Sword of Honour Trilogy by Evelyn Waugh. The trilogy was originally published in 1965, but it's made up of 3 books. Men at Arms, which was written in 1952, Officers and Gentlemen in 1955, and Unconditional Surrender in 1961. I have the book here. For people watching, they can see it's pretty thick. It's 899 pages, which is about 300 pages short of War and Peace, so it's a pretty hefty book. The trilogy takes place during World War II, and it's the story of Guy Crouchback. He's a 36-year-old upper class English gentleman from a very old, established Roman Catholic family. We meet Guy in 1939, and he's been living in Italy for 8 years, just before the war starts, recovering from a failed marriage with his ex-wife, Virginia Troy, who was unfaithful and left him. Guy's been in Italy sort of feeling isolated from the rest of the world, and then when World War II breaks out, he realizes that this is his opportunity for meaning, and he believes that it's a noble effort. In the first book, he struggles to find a regiment that will take him because he's 36, which is considered old in the 1940s. But he's eventually taken by a completely fictitious Royal Corps of Halberdiers, which is obviously Waugh's invention. So the trilogy follows Guy's experiences throughout the war and his growing disillusionment with the war itself when he witnesses chaos and ignoble actions unfolding around him. Thank you very much, Greg, for joining me. I hope you're well today, and I look forward to talking to you about the Sword of Honour trilogy.
You know, let me say at the outset, I think it's better to tackle this as 3 separate novels, and they work that way. You should read them in order, but, you know, you'll get intimidated by a 900-page book, whereas each one of them is just a regular length, and they're so much fun.
So tell me why this trilogy makes your top 5.
Well, I think... Graham Greene and Cyril Connolly and Penelope Lively and a whole host of other critics regarded this as the finest work of fiction to emerge from World War II, and I would agree with them. And I think it's incomparably brilliant Evelyn Waugh effort. It's a deep work of art. It's a great comedy. It's a genuine human story. There are memorable characters, you know, the astonishing Abthorpe, a comic figure whom Waugh has to kill off at the end of Volume 1 because he's such a scene stealer. There are other characters every time they come on the stage. Brigadier General Ben Richie Hook. You think, oh, yippee, what fun this is going to be. But actually, of course, it's a profound meditation as well. It addresses one of Waugh's perennial themes, which is how does a civilised man conduct himself in an uncivilised war? Guy Crouchback is no superhero. He's nobody's idea of a romantic lead, but he is a good, decent, civilised man. He's also a Catholic. That's important to him. And he tries to locate himself in history. He tries to behave honourably. The book, in some senses, is a love song to the British Army. But it is a love song of disillusion eventually. Eventually, Guy falls out of love with the army. And the army for Waugh stands as a sort of a metaphor for the Catholic Church and indeed for the whole of Western Christendom. A magnificent institution which is, goes back hundreds of years and has its hierarchies and its customs and its traditions and is being corrupted by modernity. You don't have to buy up all of Waugh's sort of reactionary views to see that his critique of modernity is very powerful. In some respects, this is a book about the opposition between integrity and modernity, the opposition between decency and cleverness. And of course, everything is so ironic. Even the title, The Sword of Honour, refers to a sword which the British king makes in honour of the people of Stalingrad, as if being an ally of Stalin is an honourable thing.
Yes, going back to that, the theme of the modernisation, and Waugh really hated the modern world. I think he wanted to have been born sort of 2 centuries earlier, didn't he? He never learnt to drive. He never learnt to use it. He hated using the telephone. He hated everything about modernity. And that seems very much an autobiographical sort of appearance of Guy Crouchback is Evelyn Waugh in so many respects. It's him It's not only him in real life, but it's what he wants to be as well. He wants to be an upper-class Englishman.
Well, that's right. That's right. So I'd say yes and no to that. Waugh did hate modernity, but a lot of it was caricature. So Waugh operates at so many levels. A lot of it was self-caricature. He never had a political program. He didn't really want the world to go back to the way it had been. I mean, he didn't object to penicillin or central heating or anything, but he just could see the odious qualities of culture that were coming through. So, and now Guy Crouchback is based on Waugh's personal experiences, but Guy is in many respects not remotely like Waugh. Guy is faithful, Guy is modest, Guy is sober. Now, none of these adjectives could have applied to Evelyn Waugh in any. Guy is a quintessential Englishman. He's polite. He's a little diffident. He doesn't like to make a fuss. He does the right thing, even to the extent of tremendous heroism. And he is a decent person. Waugh, in a sense, an English writer I like very much, Piers Paul Reid, wrote a wonderful biography of the actor Alec Guinness, and he had a great insight. He said Alec Guinness was essentially a very nasty man who struggled all his life to be decent. And there was heroism in the struggle. Waugh was very much like that. He was an incredibly nasty, misanthropic, difficult person who nonetheless tried all through his life, especially through his religious faith, to be a decent person, to behave decently and to celebrate the decent. And one of the things I love about this book is it's a celebration of Guy Crouchback's decency. So Crouchback, as I say, is not a superhero, doesn't have an IQ of 210. He's not a muscle-bound fellow. He doesn't, win the girl. He doesn't win the war. But there's a theme of moral survival. Guy survives morally. He becomes disillusioned with the army. He hates the fact that Britain forms an alliance with Stalin. There's a passage, Bella, I've gone on a bit in this answer, but there's a passage I'd love to read for you at the beginning of the book, where Guy can see the moral purpose of fighting the Nazis. And he's in Italy, and he thinks to himself, he had expected his country to go to war in a panic, for the wrong reasons or for no reason at all, with the wrong allies in pitiful weakness. But now, splendidly, everything had become clear. The enemy at last was plain in view, huge and hateful, all disguise cast off. It was the modern age in arms. Whatever the outcome, there was a place for him in that battle. And that sort of fuses Guy's view of himself and the great sort of historic cause he was involved in fighting first the Nazis, and then later on he was very upset about the alliance with the communists.
And it really did give him, the war really gave him that meaning, didn't it? Because he was sort of listlessly floating about in Italy, wallowing in a little bit of sort of pity after his divorce. And the war comes along and he's just, that's it. That's his destiny, isn't it? As you say.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, that it draws on Evelyn Waugh's own experiences. His first marriage ended because his wife took a lover and lost interest in him.
Which is Virginia, really, is the wife, the fictitious wife. Guy's wife does the same thing. There is a little bit of a similarity there.
There is, although I don't think Evelyn Waugh's first wife was either as glamorous or as wicked as Virginia. Virginia Troy is a very wicked woman. And the theme of the betrayed...
She really is.
And the theme of the betrayed husband, of course, is another one that Waugh writes about a lot. So like all novelists. So I think that Waugh is a novelist of the first class, amongst the 5 or 6 greatest novelists the English language has ever produced. But all good novelists and all great novelists have to draw on what they know. And so somehow or other they have to transcend just writing about themselves. Nothing is worse than writers writing about writers who are just themselves. But nonetheless, for background and incident and context and everything, they do draw very much on what they knew. And Guy's sense of injury and woundedness at his wife's betrayal, which he never gives expression to because he's an Englishman. He doesn't talk about these things. He certainly doesn't go on a kind of Oprah Winfrey, self-realization couch. Of,
No, he doesn't.
Please boost my self-esteem. No, he goes off to fight a war.
Yes,
and one of the he prays a lot in this book. And he has a very devout father who is a wholly good person in this book. One of the most positive character in the whole book.
I think he is the most positive. He is the father that Waugh probably would have wanted as well. He's the
Absolutely
perfect gentleman, sort of almost saintly with his interactions with other people.
Quite saintly. And again, that's a very hard thing for an author to attempt, the portrait of a saintly character. But Guy's prayers are very often, please, let me have a useful role. Let me do something. And of course, it's important to say too, the book doesn't end in a despairing note, even though Waugh himself, of course, he was so misanthropic and, such a misery guts, enjoyed ending at a point of loss. He's such a good storyteller and he's so faithful to human truth that in the end, Guy, gets back with his old wife, Virginia, who is pregnant to the most odious, terrible person
Trimmer.
in the whole novel, Trimmer. And Trimmer, who is a sort of a prefigurement of the Kardashians, celebrity
Trimmer.
with no virtue whatsoever.
No talent, and gets there by luck.
No talent and chicanery and dishonesty and so on. Dreadful,
And a
odious
hairdresser.
creep. A hairdresser who becomes a fake war hero, and this is everything that Waugh didn't like about modernity, the plastic nature of celebrity. But Guy gets back with Virginia because she needs, we're talking about a long time ago, she needs a father for her baby, and so he's very happy to do that. And then she is killed in the Blitz, and he then has the son, and right at the end, he marries a young woman from a Catholic family who had spent some time in a convent and so on. And even though Waugh didn't really want to give Guy a happy ending, and in an earlier version of the novel, they go on and have other sons. And Waugh took that out because he was so unhappy at having a happy end. But his fidelity, as it were, to the artistic truth couldn't stop him. It's not a story about the destruction of Guy Crouchback. It's a story, in my view, about the moral survival of Guy Crouchback. And that's why I've always found this book incredibly inspiring because, you can be a little bit uncoordinated like Guy Crouchback and a little bit lame and not the most popular fellow and all the rest of it, but still you can do something that's worthwhile.
Do you think it's Waugh saying that the objectivity of sort of the truth of the morals of right and wrong will prevail? Do you think it's for eternity? Do you think there's a deeper sort of a comment, not on Guy himself, but on the morals that Guy adheres to?
Yeah, I think that is true. But Waugh, of course, is a very subtle moralist and he's a very good novelist. So he doesn't draw the moral out. He leaves it there. You can infer what you just said, I think, is a perfectly true inference that you can draw out of that book, especially in the words of Guy's father. At one point, Guy's father is all talking about the fortunes of their family, this minor aristocratic English Catholic family. And Guy says, look, do you really think God is worried about the preservation of one minor English Catholic family? And Guy's dad says to him, well, Guy, we know that God is concerned when even a single sparrow falls from a tree, that this doesn't happen without our Father's knowledge and care. So of course he's concerned with our family. And all the way through, Guy really has no answer to his father. He has a wonderful dialogue with his father, and his father is also doesn't push his dogmas down anyone's throat, and then he dies relatively early in the piece. But the voice of the father explicitly states what is Waugh's view, which is that the divine economy supersedes and is greater than the human economy and can't always be understood within the human economy. So, Guy doesn't win any medals and everybody he likes either turns out to be a traitor or he doesn't do them any good through his efforts or whatever. Not everyone he likes. The halberdiers are good guys, Jumbo Trotter and Colonel Tickeridge and he loves the fellow feeling. Of course, in the army himself, Waugh found very little of that because he was such a difficult fellow to get on with that, the soldiers, nobody really wanted him. He was very brave. He was insanely brave, but no one wanted to serve with him because he was such a difficult fellow to get on with.
It sounds like he was a difficult fellow to get on with in all aspects of life. I was watching an interview with someone who had known him as a child, and the famous story is that they couldn't get bananas after the war, and Waugh was telling his children about how they were going to get a delivery of bananas the following week, and the children were so excited, and all these bananas arrived, and he told them to stand around in a circle, and he ate every single banana in front of all his children instead of handing them out.
I have a strong suspicion that story is apocryphal.
Oh, do you think?
Although it has an element of Waugh in it.
It does.
Even though he was misanthropic and difficult, he formed very deep friendships and very deep human attachments. His children all loved him. They didn't turn against him, they didn't go and commit suicide, they didn't adopt different surnames, and his wife loved him. And he had very deep friendships, with Monsignor Ronald Knox and lots and lots of other people, with other writers, Anthony Powell, with George Orwell. So you would imagine that Evelyn Waugh and George Orwell would be on the opposite ends
wouldn't you?
Any political argument. And yet they were great friends, and they recognised that each was a great writer. And it was, when I said before he was misanthropic, he was, but it was more that he was moody and difficult and very bad in drink. And his friends distinguished between the drunk Evelyn and the sober Evelyn and so on. But he was also the cleverest man in England, so he was also good fun to be around,
So back to the book in terms of characters, you mentioned sort of like it feels like a bit of a stage that the three books when they're put together, those characters come in and they go, and there's many people to keep up with. But there's some standout characters that really almost threaten to take over the novel, take over from Guy. One of them is a chap called Abthorpe, who features very very much in the first novel. Do you want to talk a little bit about Abthorpe?
Yeah, Abthorpe is a wonderful character. I loved Abthorpe. Anybody who's read Anthony Powell's 12-volume sequence, A Dance to the Music of Time, will see Abthorpe's evil twin in Kenneth Widmerpool. And Abthorpe is a particular type of Englishman. He's sort of completely deaf to irony and very earnest, plodding sort of guy. The sort of guy that nobody really likes, very clumsy, and yet full of a conviction that he's tremendously important. And he often succeeds in life simply because of his own sterling conviction that he is the most important and most successful person around. Now, Abthorpe joins with Guy, and they're about the same age. They join the army together, and all their fellow trainees dub them both uncle because they're so much older. There are 20-year-old bank clerks and these two guys in their mid-30s. And so they form an odd friendship, and Guy is happy to put up with Abthorpe's madness. And then two things I draw your attention to about Abthorpe. Abthorpe is a germaphobe, like Donald Trump. He's very scared that he's going to pick up some disease from sharing the latrines with the fellow soldiers. So he imports his own portable loo, the Thunderbox.
Yeah.
And he hides it in the grounds of the boarding school where they're doing their military training. So the first volume is called Men at Arms, and of course they couldn't be less like Men at Arms. They're like kids at a boarding school, and indeed they are at a boarding school. That's where they're doing their training. And he hides his Thunderbox in the grounds, and then the wicked Colonel Ben Richie Hook keeps going out and using Abthorpe's Thunderbox, and Abthorpe gets increasingly distressed that someone is using his Thunderbox, and he keeps hiding it and putting it in chains and so on, and finally Richie Hook blows it up.
Yeah,
and
with Abthorpe in there.
With Abthorpe in there. It's one of the great comic scenes. So this is a novel of profound seriousness, but there's so much wonderful comedy in it. The other great comic scene is Guy is estranged from his wife, Virginia, but he doesn't hate her or anything. In fact, he probably still loves her, but he's very distressed that she left him. And he finds that she's floating around and he's floating around, and he feels full of life again because the Royal Corps of Halberdiers has brought him back to life. So he has dinner with her one night, and he plans to seduce her because she's still his wife. So it doesn't break them. This is a very Evelyn Waugh attitude. I don't know that any human being would ever feel this way, really. And in some respects, it's a bit out of character for Guy Crouchback, who is so modest. But because he thinks Virginia is still his wife, he can go forward and seduce her. And he has her in his hotel suite for dinner, and things are moving along. And then bloody Abthorpe keeps ringing up. And he's drunk because he's also a bit of an alcoholic, Abthorpe. And every moment that Guy achieves a plateau of promise, so to speak, with Virginia, the phone rings and Abthorpe wants Guy's advice or something, or wants to come along and join him at his hotel. And of course he spoils the whole evening. Virginia finds out what Guy is really up to and denounces him for being a gormless prig and all the rest of it. And this scene is so screamingly funny. I must have read this scene 100 times, but I picked it up just the other day in preparation for this conversation, and I couldn't read it again without falling about laughing. And Abthorpe was becoming such a big character. So Whitmapool, his analogue, did take over A Dance to the Music of Time, and Anthony Powell ended up writing. Whitmapool became his main character. Abthorpe was too good. He was too rich, too full of comic genius to keep going in this. So Waugh had to kill him off at the end of Volume 1. Otherwise, he would have dominated the whole story. And you get this. I mean, Waugh was a great craftsman, but you get this mystical sense of the novelist not even completely in control of his own characters, that they just come on the page and they have a life of their own.
Oh, Abthorpe's definitely got a life of his own. I think he was very much in danger of just sort of distracting us from the rest of the book. It would have turned into high comedy for the rest of the for the rest of the other two in the trilogy. And then there's you mentioned Richie Hook, Captain Richie Hook,
yeah,
who has
Brigadier
Richie Hook, who has one eye.
So,
and is based on someone I was reading who actually served under. Very, very similar. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but again, a very, very real character.
One element of Waugh's genius is that he can take satire as far as it can go while still remaining completely believable. So again, the Sword of Honour trilogy, a bit like I was suggesting to you about The Year of Living Dangerously, it works perfectly well as a naturalistic novel. You can believe everything that happens and you can believe every character. The dialogue is, of course, at a level of genius. I think Waugh and P.G. Wodehouse were the two great dialogue writers of the 20th century. But Brigadier General Ben Richie Hook, is a warrior. And that's all he is. He just wants to fight. And his view of tactics is you want to biff the enemy.
Yeah, it's biffing the enemy.
Just biff the enemy.
That's so English.
He doesn't like genteel tactics. And he says, if you see a bunch of fellows on your side getting into trouble, the boffins call it, don't reinforce failure. What he says is, just leave him alone. Go and biff the enemy somewhere else where you can biff him really hard. And Ben Richie Hook is blood-curdling. There's a terrible episode. And I mean, you can't even really joke about this. It sounds terrible, but Evelyn Waugh can write about it, where Ben Richie Hook goes behind enemy lines and decapitates an enemy combatant. It involves Guy in this escapade, and Guy is kind of goggle-eyed and slack-jawed about the whole thing. But, of course, in a war, you need people who are really willing to fight. And, fighting the Nazis and fighting the Soviet Union at the start, but then fighting the Nazis altogether, that really required soldiers who were willing to fight. And so Waugh portrays the British Army as having a genius because it can accommodate someone like Richie Hook. It contains him. He never goes one level higher where he would be able to create spectacular mayhem at a strategic level. But his martial spirit, functions in a way as great leadership amongst his other generals. And of course, it's just the sort of thing that Churchill wanted in his general, just the sort of thing that Abraham Lincoln wanted in his generals. Abraham Lincoln understood that to destroy the Confederacy, you had to destroy the Confederate Army. So it wasn't until he got Ulysses S. Grant that he found a general who would do that. Well, Ben Richie Hook is a sort of the Ulysses S. Grant of the British Army in World War II, according to Guy. And then eventually Ben Richie Hook grows old and dies in some ridiculous escapade. But Guy is devoted to him. He thinks Guy could never be like that himself, but he sees a tremendous martial spirit. And again, Ben Richie Hook is a character you just think, as soon as he comes on the page, you think, oh, wow, yippee, what fun this is going to be. Yeah. It's like a visit from your favourite uncle when you're a kid. You think, oh, this is going to be terrific. What's Ben Richie Hook got in store for us now?
No, it is absolutely brilliant. And we could talk a little bit about Virginia, who is not a very nice character. She's probably the only female character in the book. There's a couple, but she's the main female lead, I suppose, in a way. But she still only appears very briefly. It's tantalizing. You get tantalizing looks at Virginia, but those looks are not complimentary.
No. Waugh had a genius for suggesting character through dialogue. So, novelist we were last talking about, Christopher Koch, I think he's a great novelist, but I thought if he had a weakness anywhere, it was in dialogue, whereas Waugh is a genius with dialogue. And Virginia's dialogue is very, you get her character through her dialogue. There are one or two other female characters who are much more sympathetic. Guy's sister, who looks after him and whose son gets taken prisoner in war, and she's desperately upset about that. But then he says to her, well, look, would you have had your son be a coward and not fight? And she said no. And he says, well, there it is. Also Mrs. Stitch, who's based on Lady Diana Cooper. Now, she's a scream. She's like Ben Richie Hook. Whenever she comes on stage, you just know there's going to be hijinks and great fun. But Virginia is a certain type of woman, very much like the woman who is the wife in A Handful of Dust, one of Waugh's other great novels. She is self-absorbed, vain, very beautiful, very clever, doesn't really have a purpose in life. So Waugh, one of his critiques of modernism, of modernity rather, not of modernism, but of modernity, is its lack of purpose. So characters like Trimmer and a lot of the officers who do well, especially the ones who do well in public relations, they really have no purpose. They have no larger purpose. And Virginia has no larger purpose than her pleasures and her ease of life. So she has a series of lovers, and after she leaves Guy because he's a bit boring, and he probably was a bit boring. And then, but he thought he was doing everything right. You know, he was attentive to her, and he was a successful farmer, and he was managing the family money and all the rest of it. And then she circles back into his orbit because she is in need. And yet she is clever enough that she ministers to him well when he is sick. And there is, you get from Waugh a sense that even though he doesn't like Virginia, there is something lovely about her presence. And a Guy is happier when he's in her presence, even though she is very cynical. Now, oddly, the fact that the main female character is essentially so, you know, such a bad person means that this book has not endeared itself to women historically. But there you go. There are lots of bad guys, lots of bad blokes in this book as well. He only, I think, ever wrote one book where the lead was a female and she was completely sympathetic, and that was the book Helena, which was about the mother of the Emperor Constantine. And she is a wonderful... So there are sympathetic women throughout his literature, but of course he never wrote from a woman's point of view. He had this very old-fashioned idea that he understood men better than he understood women. And
I think he probably did.
Yeah, I think that was a fair call. I think that was a fair
call on his part. Yeah, she's not an endearing character, but you know, we were saying earlier before we started recording that you haven't met any women who actually like the character of Guy Crouchback. But actually, you know, I think you've convinced me. I think I'm more sympathetic now towards his character. He might be a bit dull, but he's the salt of the earth. He's a good man. And he tries.
You can count on him.
You can count on him. You can count on him.
Yeah, and he tries to treat everyone with courtesy and decency. You know, he is aware of his own awkwardness. So early in the book, he can't understand. He's lived in Italy for 10 years or something, and he can't understand why he's not really simpatico to the locals. But maybe he is more simpatico than he thinks he is. But his ex-wife was simpatico to the locals. The aristocratic Mrs. Stitch was simpatico to the locals. When he finds people in a dispute, he's inclined to sort of offer them some money or something like this to smooth things along, and he wishes he could just have, you know, dissolved the situation with a clever word or put himself forward into their shoes or something like that. And of course, Waugh is making a little bit of a comment on the English national character of that time, that there was a certain diffidence and restraint and a certain lack of openness, which had its good side because it was very well mannered, and which had its limiting side as well because it didn't really, you know, create spontaneity and all of that.
What would you say Waugh's sort of general comment about English society that comes through in the book was?
Well, I think you can see all of Waugh's writing in a way. Well, first of all, you shouldn't get too theoretical about it, because it functions, first of all, as a magnificent story, full of comedy and drama and humanity. But I think you can see all of Waugh's opus as charting what he sees as the decline of Western Christianity or European Christendom. And Waugh was profoundly religious. He was a convert to Catholicism, and it was the centre of his life. And of course, famously, one of his acquaintance, one of his female friends, said to him, "How can you possibly claim to be a Christian when you are so wicked and bad so often?" And he said, "If I were not a Christian, you would scarcely recognise me as a human being. You have no idea how bad I would be." And he was aware of his own moral failings, deeply aware. But the whole of his work really is an elegiac, melancholy lament for the decline of Christianity. Now, that's not a sufficiently emboldening, forward-looking program for the future, but Waugh never claimed to have a program for the future. Where he found solace, though, where he found the traditional consolation of the conservative, was in the moral survival of individuals. Charles Ryder in Brideshead Revisited, and indeed Julia. I suppose Julia is quite sympathetic in Brideshead Revisited, the heroine in Brideshead Revisited.
Yes, I was going to bring Julia up, and even Julia's sister, whose name I've forgotten.
Oh, but yes,
and she goes off to become a nurse. She does. Yeah. She's a good character as well. So
she's wholly sympathetic.
Yeah, wholly sympathetic.
A bit nutty.
A bit nutty.
A bit eccentric. A bit crazy.
But you expect that from the upper classes, don't you? I mean, look at her brother.
And Waugh only liked people who were a bit crazy. Yes. I mean, the triumph of both Guy and Guy's father is that these are two relatively normal people with no obvious psychological disorders, who are presented sympathetically by Waugh, and that's a bit unusual in itself. But where he found his greatest consolation, I think, was in the moral survival of the individual. I mean, one of his other great novels, A Handful of Dust, again has a husband betrayed, and he's a civilised man, and he finds that the Mayfair West End circles around him are very uncivilised, and then he goes off into a Brazilian jungle and gets kidnapped by a crazy man who wants him to read Charles Dickens to him for the rest of his life. And it's a typically crazy Waugh construct, but the image of the civilised man amongst barbarians, this is a very strong motif in all Waugh's work. And this is Guy Crouchback. He's a civilised man among barbarians. Not everyone in the novels are barbarians. He has friends. He's well treated. As I say, a lot of halberdiers are sympathetically portrayed, and of course the Jewish refugees he tries to help in Yugoslavia towards the end of the war. That also reflects Evelyn Waugh's real experience. He was a liaison officer in Yugoslavia. You can see why this book was so unpopular with the left historically, because Waugh saw the Yugoslav communist partisans as murderous bandits and cutthroat killers and would-be dictators, which is what they actually became. Whereas the conventional view was that Uncle Joe Stalin was a great ally and the partisans were the liberators of Yugoslavia and so on. And Guy Crouchback at the end is trying to help a group of Jewish refugees persecuted as much by the partisans as by the threat of the Nazis. Now, he's unsuccessful in doing this, but he meets great decency there. And indeed, there's a very sympathetic female character amongst that population as well.
Actually, going back to the theme of Waugh's lamentation at the loss of Western Christendom, is it more specific, or was it Waugh's lamentation at the loss of traditional Catholicism? Because he hated what happened in Vatican II. He hated the replacement of the Tridentine Mass. He hated the fact that Latin was lost, and all the the smoke and the incense and the vestments were suddenly cast aside for this modernity, I think. And I think I read somewhere that this Sword of Honour trilogy turned out to be a lamentation for the loss of traditional Catholicism. He didn't know when he was writing the book, and that's what it turned out to be. But I don't know. I might be making that up, but
no.
It's not implausible.
I think there's a lot in that, but it's very complex and nuanced and textured, as everything is with Waugh. So the Sword of Honour trilogy was written before the Second Vatican Council convened, and so he would never have expected the loss of the Tridentine Mass. But I do believe the book, the army functions both as a metaphor for the church and for Western Christendom generally. Profound loss and decay in institutions which he loved. But it's wrong to pin Waugh down too much and on specific political views. The other thing is, he was full of such mischief and such self-caricature that he often exaggerated the degree of his own reactionary. I mean, my own father was like this. You know, Dad was a pretty conservative guy and a wonderful guy, very funny and full of mischief. Once a Greenpeace fundraiser knocked on the front door and Dad said, look, I'd love to give you some money and I'd love to talk to you, but I'm just busy barbecuing a dolphin on my barbecue out the back. Now, Dad would never have heard a dolphin under any circumstances in his whole life, and he didn't have a wood chip barbecue. But this was the spirit of Evelyn Waugh. You know, it was an anarchic spirit. So
yes.
if a BBC interviewer asked him about Latin, he would not only give his own view, but he would then sort of exaggerate it by 500%, with layers of self-caricature. But
I thought you were going to tell me that he would give his answer in Latin first and then translate it and just to...
My father did a bit of that. Yeah, my father did it. He did a bit of that. But I'd take you back to the character of Trimmer. So Trimmer perfectly exemplifies for Waugh modernity. Trimmer is a cowardly hairdresser who finds himself, not that there's anything wrong with hairdressers, let me say, but...
No, we love hairdressers.
Yeah, but that's who he is. And he finds himself in the army. He's a hopeless soldier. He's a coward. He's a cheat. You can't rely on him. He betrays his fellow soldiers. But through a fantastic sequence of circumstances, British military public relations decides to market him as a great hero. So he then tours the United States, especially when Britain is trying to get the United States to come into the war. And because he's a wonderfully democratic hero. There he was, just a hairdresser, and now he's the hero of the war. And of course, eventually he develops a passion for Virginia. And Virginia is basically told, look, if you go along with Trimmer, you can have, money and free hotels and everything. Just humour him. And that is the absolute corruption of modernity which Waugh is writing about. Now, when you think what has happened with celebrity and social media and all the rest of it, that's very acute. For Waugh to understand that in the 1950s and right at the beginning of the 1960s, that's a very acute critique of modernity. But he doesn't beat you over the head with the lesson. He just lets Trimmer flourish, even as, of course, naturally, Guy receives no recognition or anything for his genuine efforts at heroism. Not that Guy wants any recognition. Guy doesn't want any medals or anything. He just wants to do some good. But I think it's more at that profound cultural level that Waugh, as a novelist, works. But of course, as a person being interviewed by the BBC and all of that, he is just full of anarchic mischief, and he would affect views which, who knows, he might have held them, but they, they're not to be taken seriously. They don't really infuse the work. Although you're certainly right, he hated the changes to the Mass. So Vatican, I think he died in 1966, and the English had just changed to vernacular liturgy a year or two before, and he hated it. I mean, one of the things that drew him to the Catholic Church was the beauty of its traditional music and liturgy.
Another theme I wanted to ask you about was the interplay of Nazism and communism in the book, because it is obviously it's essential to the trilogy and World War II. What would you say about that?
Well, here again, I think Evelyn Waugh had a really deep understanding of history, tremendously unfashionable. Guy Crouchback is happy at the start of World War II because England has gone to war with Nazi Germany and its ally, the Soviet Union. Now, there's poor little England, at that stage without the support of the United States, facing up to the two most tyrannical behemoths of the 20th century, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union under Stalin. The Nazis under Hitler, the Soviets under Stalin. And Guy thinks that's absolutely right. That is who my country should be fighting. And we are the friends of the Poles, we're the friends of the free Poles, we're the friends of the fighting free French. and he is a happy warrior. And he says to the War Office in his efforts to get accepted into the army, they say, but you're not much of a soldier and you're 36. And he says, yes, well, spend me first. Keep the young men, send me into battle. Use up us old duffers while we've still got a year or two of fighting capability in us. And he wants to fight. But as the war goes on, now this is not really a profound criticism of the Allies, but this is the way it works out. The Allies have to ally with the Soviet Union after Hitler attacks the Soviet Union. So the left likes to pretend that it was always against the Nazis. In fact, a lot of the left in the West didn't support the war when the Soviet Union was allied with Nazi Germany. The wharf unions in Australia wouldn't load the ships. John Curtin was against Menzies dispatching troops at the start of World War II to join Britain in its fight against the Nazis. And George Orwell comments somewhere that insofar as the British left had any sense of patriotism, it was directed in favour of the Soviet Union, And Waugh is very alive to this and parodies it in a number of books. As the Second World War evolves, its moral purpose becomes less clear. Of course, Britain must fight to survive, absolutely. But then, in the end, there's a joke at the end about the Poles, and of course the Poles, having been freed from Nazi tyranny, are under communist tyranny by the end of the war. Stalin was a monster, I would say, of equal depravity to Hitler, and communism was an ideology of equal evil to Nazism. Now, the whole of the cultural left hates this. They never talk about the Nazi-Soviet pact. And they hate the idea that Tito's partisans were murderers who killed every non-Nazi and non-communist source of leadership in what would emerge to be Yugoslavia at that time. In the Sword of Honour trilogy, there are one or two communist traitors within the British Army who are really working for the Soviet Union rather than for the British Army. And here I think you can make the case that Waugh's views were really much more sophisticated than the satire and self-exaggeration he sometimes went into himself. Because the Second World War was certainly an absolutely moral war. The Allies were absolutely right to fight it and win it. And in the end, I think they probably did have to reach an alliance with the Soviet Union. Yet there is no doubt there is an element of moral compromise. If the Soviets had invaded first and the Allies had reached an alliance with Nazi Germany, it would have been the same kind of moral compromise. And this is something which nobody likes to really deal with. It's challenging for the left and the right, because the right went through a period of glorifying Uncle Joe Stalin. And as I say, the title, The Sword of Honour, is about a sword which the British king had made to honour the people of Stalingrad and glorious Uncle Joe Stalin. Now, again, Waugh doesn't beat you over the head with this, but there is a consideration of these politics at a very profound level, which is not reactionary, but which is very clear-eyed and which counts the moral cost of allying, however briefly, with the communists. And of course, one reason Eastern Europe was enslaved after World War II was because of the dewy-eyed, silly view that some leaders had of the communists towards the end of World War II. I think you could make a case like that about Roosevelt, and certainly not Churchill, but of course Churchill lost power right at the end of World War II. So I think this book rewards students of history and people who know a bit about 20th century history. I mean, it's not, you don't need it in order to appreciate the novel, but I think it's making a very deep historical case as well as a deep cultural case, as well as, of course, being just a terrifically rattling good read all the way through, which always leaves you wanting to know what happens on the next page. Which is why
it's one of your 5 favourite books.
Absolutely. Exactly.
I can't really summarise it better than that, so I think we'll leave it there. And I've absolutely loved this discussion, and I really look forward to the next one. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Bella. It's such fun to talk about these books.
Thanks. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Sign up today for only $55 and we'll also send you a free copy of the first book, The Year of Living Dangerously by Christopher Koch, which will be signed by Greg and myself. Plus, you'll also be invited to a very special online town hall event that we're having in August, where you can ask Greg any questions that you have about his choice of books. I'm so excited to be sharing this new series with you. For all the details, head to ipa.org.au.